Hello, everyone. Welcome. This is Marilyn Shannon. And once again, we're here at the Breaking Free Show. And I'm so happy you're here with us. And thank you so much. It's an honor to have you. And I do know that your time is precious. So I want to give you the best information, tools, strategies, techniques, people that I possibly can offer up so that your lives will get better and freer and juicier and juicier. So before we get on with our show, I want to say hi to Amnon.
Hello, Marilyn. How are you?
I'm good. And you?
I'm fine.
What's happening?
There's nothing happening. I mean, it was beautiful 2 days we had this
Beautiful.
weekend. We worked
Beautiful.
outside.
Oh, yeah. It was beautiful.
Yep,
Beautimous.
it's getting again though now. It's warming up
It's warming
again.
up. Yeah, but
But
it's
it's
been,
okay. It's
yeah.
fine.
And school started today
Yep.
for our kids. So it's back to that stuff. But we've been continuing. So I don't know. I haven't had a vacation, but when you love what you do, it
Absolutely.
doesn't matter really. You
Nope.
don't have to feel. I don't feel it resentment at all. I just want to do what I love and love what I do, and I do. Anyway, I just want to let you all know that anytime during the show, please feel free to call us. You can comment in our chat. You can come in on Skype. So if you want to call us, you can come in at 919-518-9773, or you can connect with us on computers. That's plural, 2K Voice on Skype voice, or in our chat. You can put your name, nickname, whatever you like near our video and communicate with us there. And if you are watching us on Facebook, you are more than welcome to come over to nissancommunications.com and watch the show from there. And from there, from our website, you can partake in our chat, but you're welcome to stay on Facebook as well. Love to have you anywhere you are, but you can call in anytime as well. So I want to welcome back one of our previous guests who's been a terrific guest before and has lots of interesting information to share with us. And I think today's going to be one of those days that your eyebrows are going to go like, whoa, really? Because that's how it's going to be. So Andrew Lawler, welcome back to the stage of the Breaking Free Show.
Thank you very much, Marilyn. Pleasure to be back in contact.
Good. Glad you're here. And Andrew is the author of The Secret Token. And today we're going to have a really interesting show. So, Andrew, give us a little more information about you.
Yes, I'm a freelance journalist and author. I've written two books. The first was called Why Did the Chicken Cross the World? And the second one is the book was published by Doubleday in June called The Secret Token, Myth, Obsession, and the Search for the Lost Colony of Roanoke. I'm a science writer. I write for National Geographic, Smithsonian, Science Magazine, Archaeology, and others. And I've been pursuing this particular quest for the past 3 years or so.
So, the last time Andrew was on, we had a phenomenal conversation about the lost colony. And it was so great that actually somebody messaged me on Facebook. I don't know if I even told you this, Andrew, and personally messaged me and told me how much she enjoyed the show and she was going right out to get the book.
No, I'm glad to hear.
Yeah, so that was really special. But today we want to take this book on a little different path and go a little deeper. So, right? So
Yes.
Okay, so then now you tell us what we're going to talk about.
Well, first, to back up for those listeners who aren't familiar with the story of the Lost Colony, I'll give a really quick overview. So in the 1580s, England attempted to create the first outpost of the country in the New World. Now, Spain and Portugal had already created colonies in the New World, but England was late to the game. So in the 1580s, Sir Walter Raleigh, who was a knight in the court of Queen Elizabeth I, got together a group of people and sent them over to Roanoke Island, which is on the coast of North Carolina, not too far from where you are. And that's where the story of the Roanoke voyages unfolded. There were two colonies. The first failed and they went home with their tail between their legs, so to speak. And they tried again. And the second time, 115 men, women, and children were left behind on Roanoke Island. Now, when war with Spain broke out, the supply lines between the country of England and North America were broken for some time, and it took 3 years for a rescue mission to arrive again on Roanoke Island. And when they got here, famously, all they found was a deserted settlement and the word Croatoan carved into a post. And that was the beginning of what has been America's oldest cold case.
The search for the colony.
That's correct. So starting in the end of the 16th century, people have been wondering ever since what happened to these English men and women. And since then, there's been a lot of debate about whether or not these people actually vanished. What happened? Did they starve? Were they massacred? Was there some other tragedy? Did they try to get back to England by way of sailing, building a boat and sailing away? Or were they captured by the Spanish? So these have been some of the theories that have been postulated in the past 400 years or so.
So let me just tell everybody, one of the interesting things about Andrew that I have found out was he doesn't, how some people don't take no for an answer? Well, Andrew doesn't take information as the only answer. He's a digger, 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 digger. And so tell us the path and some of the information and what you are expanding on and exploring beyond just the lost colony, but yeah.
So for 250 years, basically, Americans forgot about the lost colony. They were too busy creating their own new world and own country. So it wasn't until the 19th century that people suddenly became interested again in what happened to the people on Roanoke Island. And that's when it gets interesting, because we talked in our last show mainly about the archaeology that's been going on to try and determine if there's physical evidence of what happened to the colonists. But when I asked a simple question, when did people first use the term lost colony? That launched me into a whole nother exploration of exactly what the lost colony means to us, not just then, but today, when it comes to matters of race and immigration. So in short, in the 1830s, that was the first time that the phrase lost colony comes around. And it was a woman, interestingly enough, named Eliza Lanesford Cushing, who was a writer living first in Boston, then in Montreal. And she was writing historical novels. She was interested in writing novels about women, but there were very few known women in early American history. I mean, Marilyn, can you name an American woman in American history prior to the Revolution? I'm putting you on the spot.
No, you are, but when was Pocahontas?
Okay, so Pocahontas would be about the only one I could name off the top of my head, except for maybe Anne Hutchinson, a couple of people up in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. But see, it kind of proves the point, right? That we can name scores of men, but we can't name any women. So she was interested in finding a female figure that she could write about, so that she could write for women's magazines, which were just starting up for the first time in the 1830s. So she was looking at casting about for a figure to create a story about, historical fiction. Well, just a year or two previous to this, a Harvard historian had written the first big best-selling book about American history. And this history of the United States was unusual in that in the previous histories, people had glossed over the Roanoke colony. They had said, well, okay, they might have died. We don't really know, but probably they just didn't survive. But this author took a different perspective. He had just come back from Germany, which was in the middle of the Romantic movement. And he cast the Roanoke colony as this great mystery, not as, oh, well, they died and who cares, but rather as we just don't know what happened. And it's such a romantic mystery. And the dark woods of Roanoke, what took place? And in doing so, he also resurrected the figure of Virginia Dare. Now, let me remind your listeners that Virginia Dare was the first English child born in the New World. And she's only mentioned briefly by John White, who was the governor of the colony who went back to England. He went back to England about a week after she was born and baptized on Roanoke Island. So after that, we know nothing about Virginia Dare's fate. We only know that she was the grandchild of the governor, Governor John White, and that he sailed away. That's the end of the historical record. So this was kind of an interesting way of seeing Virginia Dare, rather than just a child who was born, mentioned briefly in this historical account, this historian from Harvard instead called her the first English child born in the New World. So he gave her this incredible importance that she had not had before. So back to Eliza Lanesford Cushing, she obviously read this book and thought, hey, what a great idea. I could take this figure, Virginia Dare, who existed as a baby, but beyond that, we know nothing. So she was a perfect tabula rasa. She was the perfect projection screen on which to write a fictional account. So she wrote a story for a woman's magazine in the 1830s that was actually entitled The Lost Colony. It was the first time that term was ever used in print that I've been able to find relating to Roanoke. And she also brought in the figure of Virginia Dare. Now, in this account, she imagines that the colonists were all massacred after John White left in 1587. And one person survived, and that was Virginia Dare. Virginia Dare was taken by the Indians, was raised. She turned out to be this beautiful, blonde-haired, blue-eyed creature who was good with a bow and arrow. She wore a doe skin. Yet, while the Indian braves loved her madly, she remained virginal. And there are many versions of this story subsequently in American newspapers and magazines for a full century. But she had basically created this figure of Virginia Dare as a child who was not only a survivor, although we don't know that for sure, of course, but also was this symbol of the Anglo-Saxons, the English first settling in the New World. So in a sense, she was kind of the Eve for the Anglo-Saxon New World that came into being in the late 16th century. And so it gets even weirder because as time goes by, so I read these accounts and tried to make sense of them, because they got stranger and stranger as the 19th century went on. And I asked the question, why in the 1830s? So why did suddenly you see this resurrection of Virginia Dare and this sudden interest in a mystery that we call the Lost Colony today?
Can I interrupt you a second?
Yes,
You're a phenomenal storyteller, and I had to make myself interrupt you.
Go ahead.
So you were reading these fairy tales.
Yes.
Basically. What were you thinking you were going to get out of it?
Well, first, I was just interested in knowing who came up with the term the Lost Colony, because I figured if I'm writing a book about the Lost Colony, I should know where that term came from. And when I asked historians, I asked anybody I could think of who knew anything about the Roanoke voyages, no one could give me an answer. Finally, I found a professor at East Carolina University. He was a literature professor, but he was interested in Lost Colony, a little bit obsessed like many of us are. And he had done a little research and he said, I think the first mention was in the 1830s. And he pointed me to Eliza Cushing's mention of the Lost Colony, to that article I mentioned. So at first I thought, well, it's just kind of an interesting little side piece of history that I might want to pursue. But I realized then that there was something different. There was something important about this. It wasn't just about the naming of the Lost Colony. I realized that no one had been interested really deeply in the Lost Colony until the 1830s. So then I had to ask the obvious question, and that is, why the 1830s? What was so important about that period? Why then? Why not a century earlier or a century later? So I started reading up on the 1830s. What was happening then was very interesting. There was a president in the White House who was extremely divisive, who was opposed to many minorities, including Indians and African Americans, a figure called Andrew Jackson. And at the same time, Jackson was busy making sure that as many Native Americans as possible were shipped across the Mississippi and away from the great bottomlands of the Deep South that would later become the great cotton plantations that would drive the Southern and the U.S. economy for decades until the Civil War. And at the same time, there was another threat that was out there, and that was the threat of slave rebellion. In around 1830, Nat Turner, who was a slave in Southern Virginia, who was actually lived quite close to Roanoke Island, he rebelled, and a group of slaves rose up, killed lots of white people, and terrified the nation, terrified the white population, because there were millions and millions of African Americans in bondage. And there was great fear that, as had happened in Haiti, that these people were going to rebel. So you have these two things going on. You have Native Americans being shipped west. You have fear of slave rebellion and insurrection. And then finally, the other piece that happened really first in the 1830s was that you had this strange, new, frightening religion entering into what was the United States, and that was Catholicism. That's right. Catholicism at that time was considered a very dangerous foreign religion. Most white people in the United States then were of British descent, and they were mostly Protestant. But Irish and Germans were flooding into the country. It was really the first big wave of migration after the Revolution. And they were, to a large extent, Catholic, and were certainly not of that Anglo-Saxon or British stock that Americans formerly had been, mostly were. So when I started to put these pieces together, I realized that there was something more here than just a fantasy story written by a fiction writer. In fact, Virginia Dare and the Lost Colony became, I realized, a kind of barometer for white American fears about race and immigration.
This is fascinating. I mean,
Yeah,
really, huh?
I was stunned. I had no idea when I first began to dig into this.
No, this is really, really fascinating. And I knew that we were going to be talking about something like this, but I had no idea the depth of where you have taken this and how you have been able to piece some of this together. And I have no idea where you're taking it to, but this is really fascinating. So so based on this fairy tale, you were able to piece together something that was going on in history. And that's really brilliant.
Well, I then just began to follow the trail. So I began to look for any mention of Virginia Dare I could find in newspapers in the 19th century. And fortunately now it's not so hard to do, because a lot of this is online. You can really access the data in a way that was previously very, very difficult. So when I went through and I began to piece together who was writing about Virginia Dare and what they were writing, I realized that it was a legend that began to grow and became ever more strange and outrageous. And by the end of the 19th century, it's taken on a really overtly racist form, because Virginia Dare, by, say, the 1890s, was discussed as not the first English child born in the New World, but as the first white child born in the New World. You can really see the change in the language. And why does that matter? That matters because we tend to forget now in our country today that the word white has changed and morphed over the centuries. I mean, what is white and what's not? Well, in the 1890s, for many Americans, people who were of Italian heritage or Spanish heritage or Portuguese heritage or Jews were not considered white people. Even Eastern Europeans were somewhat suspect. And there were those that even felt like the Irish weren't really white. So this idea that white is just about the color of the skin is not quite right, because it was really an idea that we created and that changed over time.
So this idea of lost makes an assumption, right? Correct me if I'm wrong, that if it was lost, that they weren't massacred. There's a difference. If they were lost, they were still somewhere. They just couldn't be found. But it wasn't as definite as the colony having been massacred.
Well, I believe that the history and the archaeology show pretty clearly that the colonists, given their circumstances, were unlikely to have been massacred wholesale. They certainly weren't massacred by the Spanish, because we would have records of that. The Spanish kept very, very good records. And the Spanish were intent on destroying the colony and killing the colonists if they could find them, because they were settled what was essentially the jugular vein of the Spanish Empire, since all their ships were sailing up the coast. Now, would the Native Americans have massacred them? Well, according to some of these stories about Virginia Dare, these legends, Yes, the Native Americans are portrayed as wicked savages who are intent on wiping out the white people, these new arrivals. However, it doesn't seem likely because Native American tradition in that part of the country, from what we can piece together and what we know today, would not be to wipe out all the men, women, and children. You might kill the warrior age men, for example, but you would almost certainly take in the women and children, and they would assimilate into your tribe. These were small groups where numbers were power. The more people you had, the more food you could produce, and the stronger you were vis-a-vis rivals living in neighboring territories. So the idea that the colonists were wiped out by evil savages, I think, is a romantic 19th century idea. What I believe is behind the colony being, quote, lost is the fear that the truth was obvious, and that is that the colonists would, most of them at least, would have assimilated with Native Americans. I mean, think about it. If you don't have gas in your car and you don't have food in your refrigerator, then you are not likely to sit at home and starve. I certainly wouldn't. I don't know if you would. I would go knock on my neighbor's door and say, "Hey, can I mow your grass in exchange for lunch?" I would do something in order to survive. So the colonists, and I think most historians and archaeologists today agree, would have done just that. And the Native Americans would have been happy to have taken in people who had some very, very powerful trade goods like metal objects and clothes, things that Native Americans were really eager to have and trade for. So to have those people in their tribe would have given them status.
What about education?
What do you mean? What about education?
Were the British educated? The colonists?
Well, probably most were somewhat literate. There was probably variation. I imagine there were some who were not very literate, but there would have been some basic education. Most people would have been able to read the Bible, for example. That was the main purpose of education at that period for people who weren't upper class, upper status. So there would have been some education. They would have known, their letters basically. But you keep in mind, this is the 16th century. There wasn't mass education. Mostly people who were reading and writing in any kind of substantive way were doing it because they were businessmen or they were worked in the court. They were scribes, and that was a pretty small group of people at that point. So Native Americans, of course, did not have at that point a written language. Of course, they had a very strong oral tradition. So we know that after the lost colonists, although we can't prove for sure that the colonists assimilated, and we're not getting off the topic here, I'll explain why. But we know that as late as the 19th century, the time we're talking about, that there were plenty of white people who became assimilated into Native American tribes pretty quickly. Within a matter of months and certainly years, they would lose a lot of their English language. They would adopt Native American traditions, Native American ways, and would become fully assimilated over a pretty quick time. And often it was extremely difficult to extract these people from native tribes. So there are lots of examples in the 19th century of particularly women who were captured and then when search parties were sent to get them, refused to come back, often because they had Indian spouses by then and even children, and they had thrown in their lot with Native Americans, and they really weren't interested in becoming white people again. So the whole point is that this idea of assimilation was extremely disturbing to the white Americans of the 19th century. Why? Because it called into question the supremacy which so many whites felt over both Native Americans and African Americans. Because if your people desert and they go live with what were deemed savages, then that was embarrassing. That was shameful. That was something that you would want to cover up. So I think it seems pretty clear that the colonists, although assimilation was the obvious path for them, that was not something acceptable to many people in the 19th century. Therefore, we have to lose the colony. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, the lost colony didn't get lost. We lost them. Because if we didn't lose them, it meant that they assimilated. And if they assimilated, that called into question the very nature of our society, which at that point was very much a caste society defined by your color and by your race.
It's fascinating that how you have connected these dots. And it sounds when you tell it, it sounds so true and so good and so probable and possible.
Well, you know, at first I was skeptical because it seemed like, well, surely other people would have seen this or written about this, but I could find very few, or if any, examples of people who had really pursued this legend of Virginia Dare in this way. And as I walked through the 19th century, I watched as she went from this kind of innocent maiden who's romping around in the forest, having adventures. Sometimes she falls in love with an Indian brave, but it never works out. Often, a white person would show up and would claim her as their bride, but usually things end badly. It's always a story of tragedy. And the more I read these various variations, I realized that she was, in a sense, this white girl trapped on an island surrounded by dark savages, the term used back then for both Native Americans and, by implication, African Americans. And this was the feeling among many white Americans in the early and mid and late 19th century, that the United States was an Anglo-Saxon creation where the English had come in, the British had arrived, and they had settled the New World. They had settled North America. They were conquering the continent. And then you have these people showing up like African Americans who want to get out of bondage. You have Catholics showing up who are of this strange foreign religion. You have Native Americans who are trying to assert themselves and to fight to keep their land. So a lot of Americans who are white at that time felt under threat. So Virginia Dare was the perfect choice for a legend that would reflect that anxiety that white America was like Virginia Dare, surrounded by dark savages, and actually not a sure bet.
So we really don't
betrays
know.
the anxiety of Americans at that time.
Right. So we really don't know what really. So there's nothing coming from the English or the British about Virginia Dare, since
No,
okay,
no, there was no mention of Virginia Dare that I've been able to find from the mention that John White, her grandfather, makes in around 1590, in the 1590s, until the 1830s. So she ceases to be a figure at all in history. She's just a brief mention in a report that John White wrote, and kind of an offhand comment that, oh, and my daughter Eleanor gave birth to a daughter who was named Virginia. She was baptized. End of story. He never mentions her again, even when he goes back in 1590 to try and find the colonists after 3 years' absence. He arrives on Roanoke Island on Virginia Dare's third birthday. And yet, in his report, he never mentions the third birthday. He never mentions her again. So I think it goes without saying that for Virginia Dare to be resurrected in the 1830s raises the question, why then? And I think I pinpointed the reasons why.
Interesting. So now bring it to present. Does the present day validate the 1830s and what you discovered?
Well, before we get to today, let's make a brief stopover at the turn of the last century.
Okay.
And because this relates to what happens today, there's this kind of evolution of Virginia Dare, which is fascinating. So in the 1890s was probably the peak of American fear and anxiety about immigration. That was a time, through 1910 or so, that was a period where more than 1 million immigrants were pouring into this country every year. 1 million. Try and wrap your heads around that in a country that was less than half the size that it is today. So that gives you a sense of the tremendous change that was happening here that really worried people of British heritage, because they felt things were spinning out of control. The country was getting out of control. First, you had the Civil War, where African Americans were freed from slavery. And during the 1870s, They achieved astonishing political gains, both in the House and the Senate, as well as in state houses. Those were beaten back in the 1880s when Southern whites basically turned back all of those gains and made sure that African Americans couldn't vote and were no longer a threat to the political structure they intended to control. And that's when the term white supremacy really became common. That's the time in the 1880s on that white supremacy was a term that was used by white supremacists, not by their critics. People who said that, yes, the people of British heritage are the ones who started this country, they founded this country, they should retain control of this country. They're the ruling class, and any threat to that was a threat to the basis of the United States and its Constitution. And ironically, of course, its Declaration, which declares that all men are created equal. So one of the many ironies in our history. So it was this combination of the fear of African Americans gaining power and this wave of immigration that sparked this revival in Virginia Dare's popularity in the 1890s up until the 1920s. I can tell you some about that if you're game.
Well, I want to know how. It's so interesting that here's a figure that nobody really knows anything about, right, but she's an icon, a legend, and she represents so much of, what's been going on in history. So how did she come back? Why did she come back up again?
So in the 1890s, a woman named Sally Southall Cotton, she was a farmer's wife who lived in North Carolina, and she was appointed to be the person to help do the women's exhibit for the Chicago Fair in the 1890s for the state of North Carolina. And she used that platform to really push Virginia Dare as a major American figure. Now, part of this was simply she wanted to boost the home team. She was from North Carolina, which at the time really lacked a creation story. Virginia had Jamestown, South Carolina had Charleston, but North Carolina really didn't have a story of how things started there. And Virginia Dare lived earlier than the settlers at Jamestown or in Charleston, so she latched on to this figure as somebody to herald and to commemorate. And she tried very hard to get people to listen to her. Most people didn't at first, but then she wrote a poem. She wrote a poem about Virginia Dare called The White Doe. And it was kind of a ripoff of a Wordsworth poem from decades before. But in this story, Virginia Dare is, of course, raised. She's beautiful. She's blonde. She's a teenager running around in the woods, good with a bow and arrow. We're used to that figure. But then there's a change in the way she writes about Virginia Dare. In this version, an evil Indian shaman shoots an arrow that turns Virginia Dare into a white doe who is basically cursed and roams the forest, which nobody can get. Nobody can shoot this deer. Everybody wants to, but she's trapped in the body of this white deer. And it's only years and years later when the English arrive again that a party of English hunters manages to shoot this white doe. And when the arrow enters the heart of the deer, she turns back into her human form, into the Virginia Dare that we all know and love. And she lies on the ground, writhing in pain. She's about to die. She's just been shot. And the hunters are horrified to realize that they've shot not this mysterious white deer, but this beautiful young woman. But she doesn't die so quick that she can't tell her story. And a large part of the poem is her telling her story to these hunters who are gathered around her. And in the end, she makes this remarkable statement that, to summarize, I'm so glad that you're here. Don't feel bad about shooting me. The good news is that civilization has arrived. The white man is here. The red savages will be destroyed. We're bringing civilization to this place of barbarity. So my death is not in vain. And then she expires. So, and there are other versions of it as well that from that period. But you get the message that this is a deeply, deeply racist idea that that North America belonged to white people, and that these people who were here before, Native Americans, were to be wiped out, were to be displaced, if not destroyed completely. So it's a it's a really
Mhm.
shocking poem, and it was immensely popular when it was published around 1900. People bought it in droves, and she became somewhat of a celebrity. She traveled around, although she was in her 50s, she traveled around the country doing readings of this poem while wearing a doeskin outfit. I'm sorry, I could find no pictures of her in that doeskin outfit. I'm sure they're out there somewhere. And if a reader has found one in their attic that belonged to their grandmother, let me know.
So, okay. So before we go on with Andrew, I want to just remind everyone to please call in 919-518-9773 or computers 2K voice on Skype. We have our chat open. You're welcome to join us there. If you're on Skype, if you're on Facebook and watching us there, please feel free to come over to nissancommunications.com if you want to enter our chat, but you can certainly call us into the studio and ask questions. If you're a history buff or just love these stories, anything, we'd love to hear from you because it is, I mean, it is interesting. And some of the things that I think about are little questions that I would have that if Andrew and I was sitting across the table, I would be saying, well, what about this? Or what about that? But it seems like there's so many big things to talk about. I just don't want to talk about the little things. But it seems like she's such a legend. I mean, we've made her into a legend of whatever is going on in the world at the time.
And she became immensely popular. This is something that surprised me because I was not, I knew that Virginia Dare was a legend, maybe kind of secondary to, say, Pocahontas, not as known. But when I read up on what happened in the early 1900s, I was astonished to find that she became uh, a name. Many people were named Virginia Dare. In fact, just the other day, I was at a book fair in Mississippi, and a man came up to the microphone and said, my grandmother was named Virginia Dare. I said, when was she born? He said 1910. I said, perfect. That's just the point where she was at her peak in popularity. There were dress shops named after Virginia Dare. There were Virginia Dare clubs all over the country, from Brooklyn to Seattle. I'm not sure what they did in these clubs. They were kind of women's clubs. There
So
were
does she represent
steamers.
in the scheme of those things? Is in that period? Is she representing like freedom, women's rights? What is she representing?
Well, it's hard to know exactly. I think she represented many things to many people. I think for most people, though, she was the first white child born in the New World. So she was a symbol of the white power structure and the beginning of the country as we know it. For others, I think for women, it was a little more complicated because I think she
Ask.
was both a symbol of white supremacy, but she was also a symbol of a woman who arrived in the New World, grew up, and was able to do fine on her own without men. Thank you. So I think she played both of those roles for women as well as for whites. She wasn't one or the other. She was a combination, and
Right. But
she.
we've given her, for what reason have we given her the identity we've given her? Why did we need her to be these things?
We needed a way to express the great anxiety and hope that white Americans were feeling in the 19th century. So people who were of British descent at that time, they were terrified that the country was just skittering out of control, and that brown people, defined largely, that would be anybody from Native Americans all the way to Italian immigrants or Jews, were a threat that they were going to take over society. So Virginia Dare kind of encapsulated those fears. Remember, she's trapped alone on this island filled with dark savages, which is a perfect metaphor for how many white Americans were viewing the country at that time.
Mhm.
This is the period where people in the late 19th and early 20th century talked openly about race suicide. What they meant by that was that the white race was actively killing itself off by allowing immigrants to come into the country, by allowing African Americans to presume to have political power, that these were really dangerous threats to our national security. So Virginia Dare was a perfect, virginal symbol, kind of a Protestant Madonna, who could symbolize our fears and our hopes for those who were running the power structure and who were really terrified that the country was changing, because the country was changing.
I
And
can see us giving her a new identity. that she takes on whatever identity we want her to take on that keeps evolving into something.
Yes,
Well,
that's
okay, so
correct.
you need, right? Okay, so but I need for you, because I'm so excited about this next piece, to bring us up to date.
Okay, so amazingly enough, Virginia Dare kind of vanishes in the 1930s. Something happens. The Depression, of course, is on. That's the big news, and Americans are really trying to pull together in a new kind of way. Virginia Dare kind of falls by the wayside, and instead, the story of the lost colony kind of becomes a story of history. Becomes a story of people who arrived here in this country. They struggled. They tried to survive. We don't really know what happened, but the point is that they tried hard. So it reflected the time in the Depression where people had to really struggle to survive. So the Lost Colony kind of answered that need for a legend about people who were having a hard time and weren't able to make ends meet, so to speak. Now, by the time World War II happens, and the 1950s and 60s come along, Virginia Dare becomes more or less a fairy tale for young women, for girls. You find a lot of the books about Virginia Dare, for young teenage girls. She's off on the woods on her own, having adventures. So the white supremacy piece kind of goes away, and Virginia Dare wine, for example, which was wildly popular in the early 20th century, that ceases to be the same kind of sell as it was before. Now, interestingly, Virginia Dare made a resurgence recently, and I mean in the past few years, with the kind of rise in the rhetoric about anti-immigration, fears again that Americans are being overwhelmed by brown people from the outside, by a lot of white supremacy groups and white nationalist groups. Virginia Dare again has emerged as a symbol of their fears and anxieties. And as an example to that, there's a website called vdare.com that is run by a man named Peter Brimelow. And Peter Brimelow, with whom I had some correspondence, he's a former journalist who set up this website, and it's a platform for white nationalists and white supremacists. And he argues that Virginia Dare is, as she's always been, a symbol of the fear that we are allowing the white race to be overwhelmed by brown people. And this is something which has gotten in the news lately because Peter Brimelow himself was invited to a party by the White House economic advisor recently. And in the Washington Post just last week, they made note of this and also noted the whole Virginia Dare legend and mentioned the stories that I've been unearthing about her. So it's amazing to see how consistently, in times of fears of immigration and race relations, when race relations are quite dire, you see this resurgence of Virginia Dare. She shows up again, and here she is again here in the 21st century in a slightly new guise, but really it's not so different from the person who was invented back in the 19th century. It's kind of extraordinary to see that continuity over all this time of this legendary figure who, as we've noted, we know nothing solid about her except the date of her birth.
So fill us in on her persona now.
Well, now there's a little bit of a struggle over who owns Virginia Dare. And on the one side, you have people like Peter Brimelow and other anti-immigration advocates who argue that we are engaged in a kind of new white race suicide by allowing brown people to come into this country, to receive political power. And then on the other side, you have feminists. I talked with several feminists, one in particular, a writer in North Carolina who has written a book called In Search of Virginia Dare, which I highly recommend. It's her story of traveling around the countryside and talking to people about their relationship to Virginia Dare. It's a really interesting tale. And when I spoke with her, she said that the thing that really struck her is how Virginia Dare is such a moving symbol of an independent woman and of somebody who could get things done, and of a woman who was not afraid to assimilate, was not afraid to be part Indian. So she's taking it in I think in a really interesting direction, that instead of Virginia Dare being a symbol of white supremacy, the Virginia Dare actually is a symbol of this merger of Native American tradition with European tradition. So it's taking this radically different approach about the same legend, and it being a legend, legends get reshaped according to how we need them. That's the lovely thing about legends. We need them, and they show us something about who we are, what we need, and what we aspire to be. So right now, I think we have this kind of conflict over what kind of Virginia Dare we want to have in this country today. And obviously, there's room for many Virginia Dares, but I'm really curious to see what form she takes in the coming decade.
Yeah, it's almost like which Virginia Dare is going to win,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah, which says a lot. It will say a lot about the cultural war that's going on in this country, that is proving so divisive. But in the end, Virginia Dare, I think, will be able to serve whoever has the best story to tell.
Yeah, and maybe the story that was meant to be told.
Yeah.
So, with the information, how do you feel about yourself with the information that you know, with what you have gleaned, the dots you have dotted, the T's you've crossed? How do you feel about what you believe you know?
Well, I went through a period of anger because I was raised in Southern Virginia. I was raised on the story of the Lost Colony. I went to see the outdoor drama that's still performed on Roanoke Island as a child, and I didn't know any of this. I had no idea that that Virginia Dare's birthday on Roanoke Island, celebrated still on August 18th, was for many decades essentially a white supremacy rally. No one told me this, and I was kind of stunned and shocked and a little dismayed to see that we've covered up this history, which I think is really worthwhile to unbury and to examine, not to beat a dead horse, but to learn more about where we actually came from. So I feel like, as a white Southerner, I had to really look more closely at a time that I saw as more innocent, maybe, than I see it today. Today, I see it in a very different light. I think I see it in a more realistic light for what it was. And this whole debate about Confederate monuments, I think, enters into it, because the more I've read, the more I realize Virginia Dare and these Confederate monuments were largely creations of the Jim Crow South. And these are not monuments to the Confederate dead, most of them. Most of them were put up after 1890. They were put up as symbols of white supremacy, as is shown by plenty of histories that show on their dedication the talks that were given were all about white supremacy, not about honoring the Confederate dead. So I think that the Confederate story plus the Virginia Dare story has forced me to, I think, see my past a little more clearly. And that's been not easy. That's been painful at times. And it's prompted a lot of very interesting discussions in my family.
I bet. I bet.
Yeah.
I mean, it's, just the things you've brought to our attention. It's so interesting because we don't know the details for sure, but we can see the swing of events. We can look back and we can plug in these things that have occurred through the history of America and see where these things were possible. And I'm sitting here, I'm thinking, well, what happened in 1776? What happened when we had the Declaration of Independence? When did we come up with all man was created equal?
Mm-hmm.
The Bill of Rights, all these things.
Yeah. Well, these are things we aspire to. It's not something that I think anybody would say we ever were able to actually put into practice fully. But the idea being that we can improve on these things, and the same way our legends, I think, grow and expand and develop and evolve, hopefully in a way that can reflect the way that we change as a culture in a direction that we can agree on. But today, I think there's a lot of disagreement on what it means to be equal and who gets to be equal and what it is to be an American. Who is an American? What does it mean to be an American? And these are the issues raised by the Roanoke Voyages and Virginia Dare, because at the very beginning, it's clear there were more players in this story than just Anglo-Saxons or white Americans from England. That from the start, we were a very mixed community. And I think that's something that the history bears out, but which we haven't really been able to grasp. So that's where I think going back to history is really useful at a time of national trouble like today. We go back, we can ground ourselves in facts and what we can determine from the documents and the archaeology, which can give us a more solid basis on which to tell our stories, rather than spinning pure legends out of air in order to meet some imagined past.
Mhm. Well, you apparently, I mean, it's apparent that you love what you have discovered. I mean, even though it's been painful, this whole world that you have discovered, and I'm sitting here and I'm thinking, and how do I put this into words? It almost, so things are going to happen in spite of it. So now we see Virginia Dare two different ways, one on one end of the spectrum possibly, and one on the other. How it pans out is just up to the time. It's up to us. It's up to, I mean, because you can't force one over the other. Whatever's going to happen is going to happen on some level, because that's what's been happening through history. You go back, you see what's happening in history at certain times, and you see, okay, this is what's happening, and this is how she came up, and then this was happening, and this is how it was explained. And so it's like, what are you going to do? What can we do about it?
Well, legends are not consciously created, really. The best legends are inner reflections of who we are.
Mm-hmm.
They reflect something we can't quite say or speak out. So I think the polarization in this country is really represented by Virginia Dare. The feminist on one hand, the assimilated feminist here, and the white supremacy symbol here. And yet there's a lot in between. I think that these stories can't be changed. We just have to kind of decide what story we like best and what story we want to tell. And as those stories get told and are discussed, then I think we learn more about ourselves. So that's the value of these legends. They're really tools. So that's why Virginia Dare in herself, she's just a barometer. She's just a way to measure who we are and how we feel about these hot button issues of race and immigration, rather than something that needs to be changed. I think that her legend will alter and evolve as we alter and evolve, or as we don't. I think in the case of Virginia Dare as a symbol of the white supremacy movement, most people would have thought 10 years ago that idea is dead, but clearly it was just sleeping, and it's come back. So I think it shows that these legends really have staying power, and that if we pay attention to them, we can learn a lot about the continuity in who we are, that these ideas are embedded in our culture, and they're not simply going to go away when we elect an African-American president, that they will remain part of our struggle.
But it does show growth. I mean, I look at it and listen to you, and I'm seeing growth. I'm seeing things change. So in spite of how it might look sometimes. So my question to you then is, where do you take it from here?
Where do I take it? Well, I've decided to move on and to move away from these controversial issues. And my next assignment will be in the Middle East.
Oh my God. And
well, stay tuned. I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to discuss that, but first I've got to go over there and do some reporting.
So that's a big deal, but can you shut off your curiosity? I mean, you have been a really good digger. You're first of all, you're a really great storyteller, but you've got to be able to tell the stories to yourself in order to help piece them together. So you're excellent at it.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome. Are you able to just shut this down and move on?
We'll see. I mean, I think books like this, projects like this, they're like children. They might grow up and move out of the house, but they're always still there, calling you occasionally wanting money, or hey, can I come back for a day, or
Absolutely.
so they never go away. But it's certainly time to move
To
on. But
move
I'm
on.
still actually involved. I'm right now involved in investigating one little aspect of a clue regarding the fate of the Roanoke voyages that I can't talk about yet. But if I get more on it, I will let you know.
Yeah, because it's a really interesting living. It's a living legend, and all this information is, and because of where we are right now in our government, it even makes it more interesting.
Yeah.
So hold on one second. So I just want to remind everyone that I have this huge event coming up September 13th. And Amnon, if you could just play my little, don't go away, just listen to this for 1 second. We'll come right back. Hey, everyone. My name is Marilyn Shannon, and you know me as the host of the Breaking Free Show. And I just want to let you all know that I have a big event coming up on September 13th in Raleigh, North Carolina. It is the launch of my most recent book, In Just One Afternoon, Listening into the Hearts of Twins. It is very exciting because I'll have a panel of twins who will be sharing their life stories. They'll be sharing how they keep their bond alive, even when it's gray. They're going to share how they handle conflict and relationship through the eyes of twins and the lens of twins is so interesting. And there's so much to learn, so much information, so many experiences that we can gather from hearing twins that we all can increase and enhance our relationships. So please feel free to come, bring your friends, bring your children, bring your family. If you're a twin, we'd love to have you there and speak. If you have a twin in your family, you have experiences, this is going to be a room full of people sharing and listening to each other. Because when you listen into the heart of someone, listening into the core of someone, there's so much that you understand. And that is the purpose behind this. So please join us on September 13th at the American Institute of Health and Fitness in North Raleigh. And we will be there from 6 to 9, ground floor conference center. And we'll even have some light snacks. So I will see you then. Bye bye. All right. So tell everyone where they can find you and your book.
Well, I will be at the Decatur Book Fair in Atlanta this weekend, speaking Sunday at 3:45 p.m. at the Marriott. You can find the information online. My book is The Secret Token, Myth, Obsession, and the Search for the Lost Colony of Roanoke. That's available at your local independent bookstore or Amazon if you absolutely must. And I hope your listeners and watchers will run out and find more information, because a lot of what I've talked about here has been very superficial by necessity given the time, but I hope I've given you a clear picture of the fascinating story the Roanoke voyages have to tell us even today.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you have really, for me in particular, I can only speak for myself, you've really woken something up in me. I mean, first of all, writing a book based on what you've been writing a book on has been very interesting since I am writing books, but understanding how you go back to the history and how you look to see what's going on during that time and base some of what you're working on based on that and piecing all these things together and how you've dug is fascinating in itself. And then what we deem to be the legend is can any of it can make sense, but it still leads us to where we are right now, which is also very interesting. So words of wisdom from you to the rest of us in breaking free and going forward.
Well, I think the only wisdom I can offer is that history, of course, as Faulkner famously said, is certainly not dead. It's very much alive and living with us, and that this is a really good time, I think, for people to go back and focus on history, because it will give you some grounding when you read those newspaper headlines. So I say, pick up a newspaper and pick up a history book, and just try and piece the stories together. And I think it will make life a lot more interesting.
Perfect advice. And so I want to thank you for being here again. And I know you're going to be back because you are you're like our family historian. You got to come back and you tell good stories. And we're all
Great.
about that. You're welcome. My pleasure. And I want to thank all of you out there for being with us today and partaking in this story. I know that Andrew's words are sitting in my heart, and I imagine they're in yours as well. So we love you. We will see you very soon. Have a wonderful, wonderful day and keep in touch. And if I can help you with anything, please let me know, Marilyn at MarilynShannon.com. And you can find my books, I have to remember to say that, on Amazon, The Twins and the Men. And they are really interesting. And they do give you insight, tremendous insight. The men, insight into men, and the twins certainly into relationships and how twins maintain that bond now and forever. So I love you all. I'll see you soon. Bye.
You are tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. If you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety or download an MP3 audio file of it in the archives section at nissancommunications.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook. Sponsored by Telestream's Wirecast software, StreamingGear.com, Carolina Apparel, and DeltaForce.net.